Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Classic Gaming Brothers. I'm Zach.
And I'm Seth.
And we're the Classic Gaming Brothers.
That's right. We are the Classic Gaming Brothers.
That's right. We are.
That's right. So, how have you been enjoying? Oh, we're in February finally, after that year-long month.
Yeah, we are in February, so we're nearing up to all the February things.
We were technically in February for our last episode, because that came out on February 2nd.
That's true. That is true.
We didn't exist at the time of that episode airing. Only our voices exist.
Oh, I was gonna say we did exist. Like we stopped being born.
But not on the radio. We
I
exist on the radio right now.
Yes. We're just disembodied voices.
We put a little bit of our soul into each of these recordings.
That should be the new lore that we developed. Instead of us being two guys that work in a sketchy studio in Cambridge, we're now disembodied voices that exist only on the radio waves.
I mean, there's factual evidence that our studio is pretty sketchy.
That's true.
And producer Doug, he exists.
I know he exists. I can smell a cigar right now.
That's always a pleasant smell.
Well, I mean, he puts them out in the ventilation system. So
sometimes.
He flicks his buds into the vents.
But anyway, we can move on, and in true form, we can move on to the actual episode.
That sounds good.
So Zach, what have you been recently been playing?
Seth, recently I've been playing Dusk 82, released in 2021 by David Szymanski and published by New Blood. Dusk 82 is a prequel / retelling of the boomer shooter Dusk, which was also developed by David Szymanski. Dusk is a first-person shooter that I love. I played it a while ago. It was actually one of my recently played a long time ago. It is a kind of Quake-like first-person shooter where you kill cultists. But Dusk 82 is a Sokoban game. It's a game that was inspired by games like Chip's Challenge, and it kind of plays in an ASCII-like aesthetic, almost similar to like a roguelike, like the game Rogue. But it's not a roguelike. It is definitively a Sokoban game. You move blocks around, you move barrels, you blow up exploding barrels that they kind of have an explosion pattern similar to like Bomberman. And you have to kill enemies who just appear as kind of weird symbols on the screen. And it's fun. It's a fun little puzzle game that has kind of a quirky aesthetic. I'm pretty sure when you die, it just says you're not good enough and you have to restart. It's kind of a depressing thing to read, but it's an enjoyable game. I really like Dusk as it is, and Dusk 82 is kind of a fun side adventure for fans of Dusk.
It looks like if Chip's Challenge had a child with ZZT.
Yeah, it does have like a ZZT aesthetic too, yeah. I'm a little disappointed that it doesn't use actual ASCII characters, that they are like original sprites and stuff, and I think it would have been perfect if it actually used ASCII assets, but it's still fun, and I like it as it is. But that being said, Seth, what about you? What have you been recently playing?
Well, recently it was January 31st.
Whoa.
If our audience doesn't know, that's it's okay. I forgive you, but it's National Seth Day. It's not my birthday, but it's a holiday celebrating all Seths. And being a Seth, it is a holiday that I take seriously.
It is, yeah.
And in that vein of things, I only accept Seth gifts. You can also give Set gifts,
like the Egyptian god.
Yeah, or like Set, the family game of visual perception. Anyway. Zach got me a game in the spirit of National Seth Day called Sethian, which meets the prerequisite of a gift. So after a few days, I accepted it. Generally, I like to let my gifts cook a little bit. Anyway, Sethian was developed and published by Dwang Games and released November of 2016. It's a sci-fi puzzle game where you have to master a fictitious language, and the only person who speaks it is a computer, so you have to push in input symbols to try and translate a language back.
Okay.
It has some interesting music to it. It's got some very like ethereal type of sci-fi kind of music, but more on like the ethereal side versus like, I don't know, like dangery side, I guess. I don't. It's the music that you would expect when you're meeting like tall, lanky aliens who are coming in peace, and then from the corner somebody shoots them, and then a time agent stops them. But anyway, the game Sethian, it's a black screen with white buttons that you have to click through, and there's shapes that are in the keyboard versus a traditional keyboard, and then there's like an input screen and then an output screen, and you have to put in the right inputs to get the right output, but it outputs the symbols that you're inputting. So if you don't know what the symbols are, it's difficult to understand or try to get something back. So what I'm saying is it's a tough puzzle game because you have to put together like, okay, a circle is I, so maybe a circle with a dot is we, maybe. Who knows? The game certainly does, but it is a difficult puzzle game that uses language. But I'm very glad that Zach got me this game, and it is a celebration of the National Seth Day, and perhaps I will find the answer to the disappearance of the Sethianius people.
I hope you do. You know, when I saw Sethian, I said, wow, and then I bought it and I sent it to you. Now, today, we're going to be talking about a bunch of video games, but before we do, we have to kind of go into a bit of a history lesson, because we're going to be talking about a character that Seth and I have talked about a bit before. We played some of his games for Retro Rewinds and recently played, and that character is Tintin, the Belgian journalist. Before we get into the history of Tintin as a character, and then go into some of the games that featured Tintin, we'll have to talk a bit about our memories. Now, I'll go first, and then I'll let Seth take it away with his memories, because I feel like he'll have a bit more robust memories of Tintin. I remember reading Tintin comics largely because Seth had them. We had a good collection of the comics. I think we had pretty much a majority of the ones that were published in the United States at the time. So we were missing things like Land of the Soviets and Tintin in the Congo, but those weren't published in the US at the time when we owned our Tintin magazines. Neither of us would have played any of the games because they hadn't been released in the US. We might have played them through like emulation or something like that when we were getting into that, but I don't necessarily remember. Now, why we read Tintin, and Seth can correct me, but my understanding was that our parents got us into things like Tintin, Asterix, and actually even the Sonic comics, largely because when Seth went to a comic book store once, he picked up a comic that had an inappropriate back cover featuring a half-naked lady and said, I want this comic, and our mother said no, and then our father wanted us to read some comics, so he got us into Tintin and Asterix. I might be wrong. I might be like just combining things there, but I do remember that at least that story of Seth picking up a comic book that apparently had some inappropriate content on the back cover.
I definitely picked up a comic with inappropriate. I actually don't know if it was a comic or like a Scry magazine or something, or like a White Dwarf magazine or something like that. Just one of those magazines that you could find in like a turnstile. I don't know if that's why we had Tintin. I just remember that we just acquired Tintin comics, and I don't know where they came from, but I liked reading them. And we had a decent collection, but we didn't have them in order, and we didn't have all of them. There was a point in time where I started to like reading them, and when we would go on trips to Borders, I would go to the comic section to try to find Tintin comics. And I do recall one time going into Borders and finding that they had like all the Tintins, and I was super stoked, and I think I bought at least one from our original collection. So Zach actually has our original collection of Little Brown Tintin, and Little Brown is the American publisher of Tintin, where I have a full collection. I don't know, Zach, your collection's not complete though.
I have to go through and check. I think I'm missing one or two. I think I'm missing Land of the Black Gold and one other one, but I have to double check.
Now, so I have a relatively complete collection. I'm missing stuff that is not I have a complete commercial collection is what I have. I do not have things that either there isn't a comic that is inappropriate that is I do not have that never made it to America. And then there's some like Alf art, which was like not completed, so like a non-completed comic series because Herge ended up passing away before he completed that.
Herge passed away in '83, and it never got finished.
Right. So there was some unfinished ones. There was also Herge was publishing things in an appropriate time. So there's like one early one that's not really appropriate to own, in my opinion, personally. But then I do have everything that's commercially available that you can buy through traditional bookstores. However, my collection is split between Little Brown and Edgemont. Edgemont being the British publisher, and you would think British publisher and American publisher, there shouldn't be that many differences. Don't worry, there are, because it's British English, and so like I understand the words that they're saying, I just don't really get what they're talking about sometimes. Though what's interesting to me is that Tintin, Asterix, Black Sad even, they're all foreign comics, and they were published, at least I know for Black Sad, and Tintin may have been the same reasoning, but they were published for the French audience.
Yeah, and Tintin was the Belgian French-speaking audience because, Belgium is 2 languages.
I'm sure Hergé would have wanted to sell primarily in France because there were more people to buy his goods. Though, like, Black Sad is done by a Spanish group of writers. There's 2 of them, and they publish specifically for the French audience, which I think is funny. And I had the pleasure of being in France recently, about last year. And while we were in France, we had some free time, and I was like, hey, let's check out a comic shop while we're here because I want to see what they have. And they have a lot of characters and merchandise for things that we do not have over here.
Oh yeah.
But they had like Tintin figures. If I wanted to, there was a Tintin figure. I don't know if I took a picture of it, but it was of the rocket that they go to the moon in.
Oh, yes.
And it was 4 feet tall, at least.
Nice.
And it was for sale for like 500 or 600 euros or something like that. And then they had these giant Tintin figures. But they had like scale of Tintin figures. So they had like a foot tall scale Tintin figures of all of the characters. And then they had these tiny little busts that they had for each of the characters. And I got Zach and my dad a bust of Captain Haddock and also Thompson and Thompson. It's interesting to be able to where, like, if you're shopping in an American store, it's difficult to find European merchandise for products, but in the French store they just had you want a bust of Black Sad? Well, here you go.
It's
like right here.
Yeah, I mean I remember being in France and like going to a DVD shop and just having all the Asterix movies that had been out at the time available to buy on DVD, which you can't find those here. And only recently, I think things like Tintin and Asterix have been able to be released here because like Steam now allows all the Asterix games. You can pretty much get all the more recent ones, and the new Tintin game is available on Steam. And I think there is an attempt to kind of bring back Tintin to America, maybe, but right. It is slowly and surely. But getting now into the history of Tintin, and later to talk a bit about video games that Tintin is featured in. Tintin goes back way before video games. In fact, it goes back to the dawn of the 20th century when a Belgian cartoonist, Georges Remet, was born in Brussels in 1907. Georges, per his own words, grew up in a boring household. He had a love of cinema, being a fan of films by Charlie Chaplin or Buster Keaton, and he really enjoyed the film Gertie the Dinosaur by Winsor McKay, which was an early animated film. He would also pick up novels like Treasure Island or Robinson Crusoe, specifically English or American stories written in French that he would enjoy, these adventure stories. And he read these to occupy his time. George took up drawing in primary school, with some of his earliest known drawings being of German soldiers who had occupied Brussels during the Great War. He moved around to a few different schools, and during the 1920s, he went from a secular secondary school in 1919 to a Catholic school in 1920, where he would finish out his schooling. George was also a Boy Scout, joining a troop at the Catholic secondary school, and it was here he earned a nickname, Renard Curieux, which is French for curious fox. During his time with the Scouts, he took trips to Italy, Austria, Spain, and Switzerland. His scoutmaster would actually encourage him to continue drawing, and soon George was contributing illustrations to the newsletter Le Boy Scout Belge, which was a newsletter that was published primarily targeting toward scouts and scoutmasters. It was during this time George would decide to take up a pseudonym, which he chose based on the sound of how you pronounce his initials. His initials, in reverse, would be R.G. In French, you would pronounce this Hergé. So he became Hergé. Hergé's reoccurring comic for Le Boy Scout Belge was a series of comics called Les Aventures de Tutor, which featured a Boy Scout leader named Tutor who would go on adventures. Specifically, he went to New York City and then later went to the Wild West, and he would encounter gangsters and Native Americans and bandits.
After graduating secondary school, Hergé would get a job in the subscriptions department of the magazine Le XXe Siècle, or the 20th Century in English. He would briefly leave the job out of boredom, during which he enlisted and was called up for military service, which, he was bored.
Apparently, he went to the military and became even more bored, though.
What's the Belgian military service? What are they doing? Well, in 1927, Hergé would meet Norbert Wells, a Catholic abbé and editor for Levantine Sicily. Norbert Wells was also really into fascism. Norbert Wells was so into fascism that he reportedly kept a portrait of Mussolini on his desk, who was also a guy who we would find out was into fascism.
What if Norbert Wells did not know Mussolini was a fascist and he just happened to have a portrait? Just
maybe his friends.
He saw a photo of him and he was like, that man is so pretty.
That man is so handsome. Now, the Catholic Abbé Wells would give Hergé a job as he's a Catholic abbé.
So an abbot.
And also the editor?
Yeah. He also was the editor of a newspaper.
And also a fascist.
And very into fascism, yes.
I mean, I guess what else is there to do in 1927? But, so Wells would give Hergé a job as a photojournalist. However, over the next few years, Hergé would also provide supplementary work for a children's version of the publication that he worked for called La Petite Vingtième. Now, it was here that Hergé would begin writing a new comic called Tintin au Pays des Soviets, or in English, Tintin in the Land of the Soviets. The story would follow a young reporter named Tintin. I imagine now, thinking about this, that Hergé was just writing himself. He was like, I am a young reporter.
He's like, I'm a young reporter. And he's like, I'm not going to go to the Soviet Union. I'll just think about it in here.
Yes. And I'll imagine myself as a young man with a dog. So, and the story follows this young reporter named Tintin who travels to the Soviet Union with his dog Snowy, who happens to talk, and Tintin vaguely understands him. Snowy doesn't talk. Snowy only thinks dialogue, but Tintin understands him, but no one else can understand Snowy.
Yeah, like Stewie in Family Guy.
Yeah, exactly. Now, while there, the secret police stalk and harass the boy and his dog. Tintin and Snowy learn about the dangers and evil of communism. The story would be serialized and then published from January 10th, 1929 until May 8th, 1930. And the next month, in June, Hergé began to work on a sequel for Tintin and the Soviets. This time, he's going to go to the Congo, where Tintin travels to the Congo and things get really racist. And this version of Tintin is not available commercially.
In the US. Though I think actually a reprinted version has started to become available. For a while, it was not available in the US.
Now, for historical context, in the 1930s, the Congo was a Belgian colony and heavily influenced by the Catholic Church, who had missionaries that attempted to convert the people of the Congo to Catholicism, and who also had members of the cloth who were fascists. So the country was severely segregated and was an apartheid state similar to South Africa.
Tintin in the Congo is dated, to say the least, and dated in more ways than just the content. The illustrations in the original version from 1930 1930 to 1931, are similar to Land of the Soviets. They're crude and very sketch-like. But accompanying this crudeness is just the blatant racism, not only to the story, but the illustrations of the people of the Congo. Hergé would actually go back and redraw Tintin in the Congo in 1946, toning down the racism, but it's still ultimately there. You can't really scrub the racism out of a story that is intrinsically tied to racism. And that's to say, Tintin and racism go somewhat unfortunately hand in hand. Later Tintin books, like Tintin in America, would also feature some racism and racist portrayals of Native Americans. And later books in the Tintin stories would occasionally delve into stereotypes. I think it does get better as the stories go on and as Hergé began to take things a little more seriously and actually do some research. But unfortunately, there is some racism in Tintin, and unfortunately, this is a topic that's going to come up again when we cover Asterix. Now, following Tintin in the Congo, Hergé would send Tintin to America in Tintin in America, to Saudi Arabia and India in Cigars of the Pharaoh, and to China in The Blue Lotus. And it was actually The Blue Lotus where Tintin arguably took a very specific turn. Instead of playing into the stereotypes of Chinese people, Hergé actually spent time with a Chinese student named Zhang Shongren, who introduced Hergé to calligraphy and Taoism. And this resulted in Hergé taking on a more sympathetic approach to how he portrayed issues impacting China, specifically touching upon Japanese imperialism and the opium trade. Now, The Blue Lotus isn't perfect. In fact, the villain of The Blue Lotus looks like a propaganda piece from American, 1940s anti-Japanese art, complete with buck teeth. But it definitely at least showed Hergé was starting to be more sympathetic toward people and not just rely on his preconceived notions. And it also, I think, helped pave the way for later Tintin books to be more sympathetic. However, one of the next books in the series, and rather unfortunately, Tintin and the Shooting Star, would take a step back and have some very notable anti-Semitic illustrations in its original publication. This was likely influenced by the fact that the magazine that it was being published in at the time, Le Soir, was being controlled by the Nazis who had occupied Belgium. So the Nazis were very much involved in the publication of Tintin and the Shooting Star, and they would obviously want their agenda to be published, thus meaning that the villains in Tintin and the Shooting Star are both Americans and Jewish. Later versions, though, would remove the anti-Semitic references and also remove the fact that America is the bad guy. There's an interesting story with Tintin and the Shooting Star. So he wanted to rename one of the characters to something that didn't sound as anti-Semitic. So he renamed the character from Blumenstein to Bullwinkel, but then he found out after he published the re-edition that Bullwinkel is in fact a Jewish name. So he tried, at least. Though in all seriousness, there is a very sad story in accompanying Tintin and the Shooting Star. Someone at one point was interviewing him and asked him, about how the book was anti-Semitic and whether or not he found it anti-Semitic. And he said, at the time we were telling stories about villains from all different origins. We were telling Jewish stories. He said we were telling Scottish stories. So we had Scottish villains, we had French villains. But he said, who would have predicted that the Jewish stories would end up, as we know of, in the death camps of Treblinka and Auschwitz? So I think Hergé most definitely regretted Tintin and the Shooting Star. And I think that kind of was a turning point for him to really make sure that his comics were his comics and not influenced by outside sources.
The stories would evolve over the years, with the art style becoming more and more refined. Hergé adopted a style of art that was called ligne claire, which is notable for the varied width of outlines and lack of hatchings for shading. In the 1940s, as mentioned, he would also go back and redraw some of his older comics with the ligne claire style. Another evolution was in the characters. As the cast got larger, you had the bumbling Interpol agents Thompson and Thompson, the drunken belligerent Captain Archibald Haddock, the absent-minded and deaf Professor Calculus, the boisterous and slightly overbearing Bianca Castafori, and there's the pilot guy that hangs out with them.
Oh yeah, I forget his name, but he's just always there.
They come in after a certain comic and then they never leave.
Oh yes.
He was their pilot and then he got trapped on a raft with them.
Piotr Skut.
The adventures also evolved, going from a somewhat grounded adventure adventure with Tintin trying to disrupt a drug trade or stop criminals or the mafia, which is what happens in Tintin in America, and to stories like The Secret Unicorn and Red Rackham's Treasure, where Tintin searches for lost gold, to where eventually you go to like Destination Moon, where Tintin goes to the moon. There is also Destination Moon and On the Moon or something like that.
It's a two-parter.
It's a two-parter, so there's an entire trade just about them going to the moon.
Yeah.
And then it's a trade of them on the moon. And then there's Flight 714 to Sydney, which features not only Peter the pilot, but also ancient aliens and flying saucers. His stories get fantastical, and Tintin maintains a kind of like he's like a straight man, everyman kind of character where he's always maintaining kind of like a calm demeanor in regards to all of the things that
you know what he's
impact him.
He's like a Boy Scout.
He's like a Boy Scout. The last story, Tintin and the Alphard, would never be finished as Hergé would die in 1983 before he had the opportunity to complete the story. The unfinished manuscripts would go on to get published in 1986, however.
And the unfinished manuscripts are interesting. It follows up on plot points of earlier Tintin books. There's this whole storyline where Calculus secretly drugs Captain Haddock and gives him an experimental drug that's supposed to make the taste of alcohol be disgusting, and he gives it to Haddock, and Haddock quits drinking because of it, which is a big deal. Captain Haddock is an alcoholic, and in Tintin and the Alphard, it's kind of like Haddock is trying to come to terms with the fact that he can't drink anymore, so he's like getting into modern art and smoking weed. It's like kind of a strange comic, but you know, that's Hergé. Now, that all being said, Tintin was of course adapted into other forms. There were films, there was a TV show, and of course plenty of video games, which is why we're even talking about him. And yes, it did take us like 30 minutes to get to talking about video games, but you know what? That's how Classic Gaming Brothers roll. Now, the first game adaptation of any Tintin story would be from Probe Entertainment in 1987 called Tintin on the Moon. It was released for the Amiga, Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64, Atari ST, ZX Spectrum, and MS-DOS, loosely adapting Destination Moon and Explorers on the Moon. The game is a shoot-'em-up and side-scroller. During the first part of the game, you have to guide a rocket, and you guide it to its path to the moon, and you must avoid obstacles like asteroids and other space debris, while picking up items to increase your score. It then enters a side-scrolling mission where you control Tintin, and you have to complete a specific objective, such as untying Captain Haddock, who has been captured by some people that snuck aboard the rocket ship. It then goes back to the flying sequence, and then back to the side-scrolling sequence, and it repeats this process for a few times, and then the game ends, and that's it. So it just goes like flying, action, flying, action, flying, action, flying on the moon.
Well, that's kind of how you get to the moon, isn't it?
Now, the next game, Tintin in Tibet, adapts the story of the same name, developed by Infogrames in 1996. The game was released for the Super Nintendo, Mega Drive, Game Boy, Game Gear, PC, and Game Boy Color. Bit Managers would actually be the team that handled specifically the handheld versions of Tintin in Tibet. All of the games have a fairly similar structure to them. You control Tintin, and you have to run from one side of the screen to the next while avoiding various obstacles. You have to meet up with characters like Captain Haddock and Professor Calculus, and when you do, the story will advance and you get your next objective. The Super Nintendo and Mega Drive versions of the game look technically superior to the rest, which makes sense. They are the stronger consoles. Both versions, for some of the levels, have a kind of playfield that combines both a foreground and a background, so Tintin can go up to the front of the screen or all the way to the back. And doing this, you kind of can avoid certain obstacles or get to certain characters to talk to them. The sprites on the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive version are also very large and colorful, and they really, really nail the art style of Tintin comics. It really feels like you're playing a Tintin comic, complete down to like the font in the game being very similar to the font used for the comics. The Mega Drive version does unfortunately suffer from the fact that it has the worst music that I've ever heard, which I'll play a bit of the Super Nintendo version here. And then the Mega Drive version here, so you can get a comparison. The Game Boy Color and Game Gear versions are just fairly straightforward platformers. They do still kind of keep a Tintin aesthetic, though they are obviously limited by the fact that the Game Boy and Game Boy Color and the Game Gear were just not as strong consoles.
Prisoners of the Sun would release the next year in 1997, also developed by Infogrames and Bit Managers. The game adapted the comics of the Seven Crystal Balls and Prisoners of the Sun, and the game isn't actually that notable because it plays basically the same as Tintin in Tibet, though the SNES version of the game does have pretty fun sequences where you have to dodge the ball of lightning that shows up in the Seven Crystal Balls. Entering into the 3D era, Tintin Destination Adventure would be developed by Runecraft and published by Infogrames in 2001. The game adapts multiple stories, specifically The Black Island, Red Rackham's Treasure, Land of Black Gold, Explorers on the Moon, and Flight 714. Despite it being in 3D, the game features mostly 2D gameplay similar to the previous Tintin games from Infogrames. You primarily have to run from the left to the right and collect items. You do have an attack, so you can beat up various bad guys that you encounter on the way, just like Tintin does in the comics. Spoiler, he doesn't.
He sometimes hits people with like the butt of his gun.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
He doesn't really kill people. He carries a gun.
Sometimes the police just give him a gun to carry.
That's true. Because that's what you should do with a young child who is acting as a reporter. Hand him a revolver.
There's a frame in Tintin Goes to America. He's involved with chasing the mafia, and he is told by the police to jump on his car, the sidewall of the car, and then the police officer hands him his gun to shoot at the mafia while Tintin is holding onto the sidewall. And I was like, that's great, what a young child should be doing. Anyway, Destination Adventure, back to the game, also features some 3D driving segments. Next, in 2011, The Adventures of Tintin, The Secret of the Unicorn would be released by Ubisoft for the PC, 3DS, the PS3, the Wii, the 360, and mobile devices. This would also be the first Tintin game released in the United States. The game isn't actually an adaptation of a book, but rather a movie tie-in for The Secret of the Unicorn movie that came out in the same year. The game is a combination of 2D and 3D platformer. For some sequence, you explore a standard 2D environment, while other sequences move to a more 3D style of movement. Besides these sequences, you will also have to solve various puzzles. I'm sure there's a bunch of quick time events, and as a movie tie-in, it's probably a mediocre game at best.
Yeah, I think most of the reviews are like, hey, it's fun because we get to play a Tintin game for once, but it's not great.
Most recently, the game Tintin Reporter Cigars of the Pharaoh was released in 2023 and was developed by Pendule Studios. The game plays like a 3D adventure game where you explore various places as Tintin and you have to solve various puzzles. You also have segments where you get to play as Snowy in some sequences that require you to go through an area that's too small for Tintin. The game has received mostly mixed reviews, as any Tintin game would, and with some reviews criticizing the frequent QuickTime events and simple puzzles. And to be fair, for 2024, if you have a pile of QuickTime events, you should go back to the development. I feel like QuickTime events have moved out of favor.
Yeah, right? And I feel like if you do QuickTime events, there's kind of better ways to do them. Like some games will still use them, but they incorporate them in a different way. Like, for example, the Telltale games, which I want to say, I think Telltale should do a Tintin game. I think that's where like Tintin would shine, is on a Telltale like adventure style game, because while Tintin is like an action kind of guy, I feel like it's less about action for Tintin and it's more about solving the mystery. And I think like a Telltale style adventure where you have to, it could be a multi-part story where you can like, have multiple endings and stuff depending on how you solve the game, but just having a proper puzzle solving adventure game would be awesome as Tintin. Or maybe in the style of like the Agatha Christie games or the Sherlock Holmes games, actually properly do a mystery. I'm not watching or reading the comics because I like action, like I do like action. You don't read Tintin for the action.
Right. Right.
And that will do it for our Tintin episode. We'll get into our retro rewind, but before we do, just some closing thoughts. I think, like I said, I think Tintin deserves a second chance at video game. Maybe Telltale, if you're listening, do it. I think Tintin is a really interesting character, and I'm happy that the earliest version of Tintin is currently in the public domain, because maybe we will get some fun, unique takes on Tintin in the coming years.
Yeah. There's a Tintin, the Big Lie or whatever that's
started. Yeah, no, so there is some stuff that's in the works. Specifically the version of Tintin from Land of the Soviets that's in public domain. Any version that has like Haddock or Calculus, not quite yet. That's not going to be until like the 2030s or something like that. But the earliest version is in the public domain, so it gives people some opportunity to play around with the character. Anyway, getting into our retro rewind, Seth had me play Super Mario Brothers for the NES. And what else is there to say about this classic game from 1985? Super Mario Brothers is, of course, it holds up. It's a great game. It's fun. It's the kind of perfect platformer in many ways. It does everything that it needs to do and more. And to be honest, I don't have many complaints about it. The only complaint I have is I hate water levels. I think the water levels are the worst. But beyond that, it's a great game. If you haven't played it, I don't know why you haven't, but go play it. And you can play it probably any way, right? Like there's millions of versions of it available. I will say with Super Mario Brothers, while I love playing it, I think honestly the best thing about it is watching speedrunners, because they make the game look so easy, and I am very bad at it. So it makes me feel a little happier watching someone do better at a video game than me. Next week, Seth, you can play Bugs Bunny and Crazy Castle 4 for the Game Boy Color.
Thanks. Zach had me play Marble Madness for the NES, developed and published by Atari Games and released for pretty much everything in December of 1984, including the one that I played on the NES. Marble Madness is a isometric platform game where you move around a marble in third-person perspective. The arcade cabinet actually had a trackball, where the home consoles had whatever was attached to the controller. So was it a directional pad, or it was mostly directional pads. There are 6 race courses that you have to beat before the time expires, and you can also play 2 players to go against each other. The first race that you do, any time that you get gets pushed to the next. Like, you get to save that time, and then all the other ones you have to just beat within the time. I had fun. This game's pretty simple. However, I think there's some joy in that simplicity. There's some games that are just really just kind of basic, and that level of basic is always fun. So, like, the puzzle, the graphics, all that holds up because the root of it is just a simple puzzle platformer, and it is fun to play, to be a marble, to try and get through the maze. Next week, Zach, you could play Landstalker for the Sega Genesis.
Great, I will. All right, everyone, that will do it for our episode. If you have any memories or thoughts about Tintin, let us know. You can do so by emailing us at classicgamingbrothers@gmail.com. You can find us at classicgamingbrothers.com. We're available wherever podcasts can be found, via iTunes, iHeartRadio, or Podbean. We're also available on social media. Just look us up, Classic Gaming Brothers or CG Brothers Pod. That being said, Seth, am I forgetting anything?
Don't play games like my brother.
And don't play games like my brother.
I've been Seth.
And I've been Zach.
And we've been the Classic Gaming Brothers.
That's right.
That's